A few weeks ago, I was sitting in the quiet corner of a cafe, and I ended up unintentionally eavesdropping on a couple at the next table. It's clearly a second or third date. And, in years past, you expect to hear talk of travel or passions, maybe some lighthearted flirting. But the conversation I heard, it felt more like a cold-blooded board meeting. The woman was leaning in, her voice was low and really focused, and she was asking her date, a guy who looked like he had his life together, about his contingency plans for a recession and his history of emotional regulation under stress. There was no laughter, just a meticulous checklist. And the guy, he was nodding, almost proud to present his risk management credentials. He didn't seem to be selling his personality. He was selling his ability to function as a human insurance policy. What struck me was just how much the energy has changed since the start of the decade. We've moved from an era of expansive mating, where everyone was chasing the highest bidder, the most glittering lifestyle, into what feels like a silent mating ice age. And people aren't looking for sparks anymore. They're looking for a bunker. The mating inflation of the early 2020s has been punctured, and in its place is this grim survivalist realism. But here's the turn. As I watched him walk her to her car, he looked less like a man in love and more like a man who had just negotiated a high-interest loan with no exit strategy. He felt chosen, sure, but there was this underlying tension, a sense that he was entering a contract where he held all the downside risk. He was so focused on being the safe choice that he hadn't noticed he was walking straight into a liquidity trap. That shift from pursuing the ideal to this desperate defense of the stable, it isn't just a change in dating trends. It's a biological and economic pivot that's redefining the power balance in 2026. And if you don't understand the underlying logic of this return to safety, you might find yourself signing a contract designed to liquidate your sovereignty before you even realize the game has changed.
That narrative provides a perfect snapshot of the current state. It's a really powerful anecdotal observation that points to systemic changes far deeper than just, dating app fatigue or some generational shift in priorities.
Right, it feels bigger than that.
It is. It suggests that individuals are responding rationally to global instability. Our mission for you in this deep dive is to move beyond that anecdote and really unpack the rigorous biological, legal, and economic logic that's driving this so-called return to safety. We're drawing on a stack of sources today that discuss everything from mating evolution and contractual risk in marriage, all the way to household bargaining dynamics, and even the strategic individual response we're calling monk mode.
Okay.
The core pivot we're examining is simple, but it's profound. Mate assessment is shifting rapidly because the external world geopolitical, economic, social scenario has become disordered and unstable.
So survival instincts are kicking in.
Yeah, they're being reactivated. And that causes security and stability to instantly become the premium commodities. We need to understand the mechanism by which seeking a human insurance policy moves from being a cynical calculation to an evolved amoral imperative.
Okay, let's unpack this. We started with the idea that the mating inflation of the early 2020s has been punctured. I see mating inflation as that brief, dizzying illusion of infinite choice, where algorithms encouraged everyone to believe they could always optimize and trade up, driving up the perceived price of admission for committed relationships.
That description is spot on. Mating inflation was a product of low-cost access to perceived abundance driven by tech during a period of relative, if shallow, economic expansion.
Right.
It inflated perceived mate value, particularly for women, by exposing them to this vast idealized pool of options. But when external chaos arrives, geopolitical tremors, accelerating economic volatility, social fragmentation, it acts like a needle to that bubble.
And it all comes crashing down.
Individuals realize the stakes are real. And this triggers a predictable, deep-seated biological mechanism that evolutionary psychologists term genetic survivalism.
So we're pivoting from aspirations back to adaptation. We need to understand the evolutionary framework that explains why stability suddenly becomes the most attractive trait. Tell us about the theory that underpins this, the RK selection theory.
This concept provides the essential biological context. The RK selection theory describes two primary life history strategies for organisms in reproduction, and they're defined by the predictability of their environment.
Okay.
So when environments are stable, safe, and resource-rich, low-uncertainty organisms often adopt what are called R strategies. The R stands for reproduction rate. This approach prioritizes quantity, expansion, maximizing the sheer count of offspring. Think a species that reproduce quickly and offer minimal parental investment.
And in the human context of the early 2020s.
It translated to prioritizing novelty, high-status signals, and expansive, high-risk lifestyles.
That perfectly mirrors the expansive mating phase you described, seeking status and thrill, maximizing options.
Exactly. But the theory dictates that when organisms find themselves in high uncertainty environments, facing threats, resource scarcity, volatility, they pivot sharply to K strategies. The K stands for carrying capacity, which reflects high competition for limited resources.
Oh, this is the opposite approach.
The polar opposite. This strategy prioritizes quality, persistence, and investing heavily in fewer, highly persistent offspring. In our current human landscape, which sources define as a cortisol-drenched world, this shift means moving away from seeking superficial novelty or high-risk status and towards seeking deep-seated stability and persistence.
The focus shifts from the high roller to the bunker builder.
Precisely.
What does this K strategy pivot look like and the criteria a person applies to a potential mate? It sounds like traditional traits like humor, charisma, or even physical appeal might be immediately discounted if the underlying foundation is unstable.
They are drastically downgraded. The new mate currency is emotional homeostasis.
Emotional homeostasis.
In a world where volatility is the norm, the ability of a partner to maintain a calm, regulated nervous system accrues immense, almost pharmacological value. Think about it this way. What is the single greatest drain on your physical, cognitive, and financial resources?
Stress. Chronic stress and uncertainty.
Exactly. So if a partner consistently introduces emotional volatility, anxiety, or drama, they are actively increasing your biological stress load, they're raising your cortisol levels, disrupting your sleep, impairing your capacity for high-level executive function.
A volatile partner is a net negative external shock. It makes you biologically less able to navigate the already chaotic outside world.
Precisely. Therefore, a partner who is a source of calm, who offers what's called domestic entropy reduction, the non-negotiable capacity to manage and reduce chaos within the household unit, is a critical asset for genetic continuity.
It's a biological hedge against external disorder.
That partner isn't just nice, they are a physiological stabilizer, protecting your health and professional bandwidth. We saw this powerfully illustrated in the story of a woman we'll call Elena. In 2021, her dating criteria were completely expansionist.
A high roller lifestyle.
Seeking the thrill, the status, exactly. But as geopolitical tremors intensified and the basic cost of energy and food became volatile, her dating criteria completely flipped, almost overnight.
What specifically triggered that change? Was it one event or just a creeping anxiety?
It was a sudden, profound realization of fragility. The source noted that the abstract threat of war or economic collapse suddenly felt immediate and personal. She stopped looking for the traditional alpha whose status was tied to volatile assets and started looking for the ultimate K-strategy man.
And her new checklist was?
Does he have real, tangible security? Does he have a deep pantry? A literal hedge against food insecurity, and the foresight to manage long-term risks? And most importantly, does he possess a calm, stable nervous system? His emotional stability suddenly displaced any volatile asset like a high-risk stock portfolio. His calmness became her primary security measure.
That moves the search for stability out of the realm of mere preference and into the category of amoral necessity. The individual is driven by a deep survival instinct, reacting directly to a high uncertainty environment.
That is the vital takeaway from this section. The search for the K-strategy mate in 2026 isn't a superficial or utilitarian choice. It is a primal, pressure-dependent reflex. When expansion is costly and risky, persistence is rewarded. And this biological pivot sets the stage for the next layer of complexity, the legal and economic landscape that actively penalizes the commitment required for this stability.
So if biology demands stability, the next question is, what institutional structures exist to provide that stability, and are they currently functional? Let's move from biology to the harsh realities of law and economics. We need to analyze how the legal structure complicates this survivalist pivot, often making commitment a serious financial and contractual risk for the provider.
To understand the economic friction, we have to first define modern marriage in many jurisdictions as a defective risk hedging tool.
A defective tool.
In a traditional sense, marriage was a contract where two parties merged resources and specialized labor to mutually insure against life's risks. The defect now stems from profound contractual asymmetry. In commercial law, a contract is viable because both parties rely on the promises made, and there are substantial defined penalties for breaching that agreement.
Right, there are consequences.
The game-changing legal shift that destroyed this reciprocity was the widespread enactment of no-fault divorce.
Okay, let's talk about that. If the law allows one party to terminate the contract without consequence, regardless of their fidelity to the promises made, pooling assets, raising children, supporting a spouse's career, what happens to the contract itself?
It becomes an illusory contract.
Illusory.
An illusory contract involves unenforceable promises without penalties for breach. Let me give you a commercial analogy. If I sign a contract to buy a house, but the terms stipulate that I can walk away without paying any penalty after you've already invested 6 months of renovation labor based on my promise,
I'd be ruined.
that's an illusory contract. You bore all the cost of reliance, and I bore zero risk of non-performance.
That makes the comparison chillingly clear.
Yeah.
So how does that translate to the investments made within a family structure, where the investments are non-recoverable, like years spent out of the workforce or specialized labor?
The source material meticulously outlines the predictable consequences stemming from this illusory contract structure, both before and after the contract is executed. So ex ante before the marriage rational actors would predict a few things.
Okay, what are they?
1, fewer marriages overall, as the perceived risk outweighs the benefit. 2, fewer children born later, only after a much longer trial period of cohabitation.
Because the biological investment stakes are too high.
Exactly. 3, a shift in investment strategies. More investment in individual careers and liquid, separate assets, and less in marriage-specific capital.
Like moving for a spouse's job.
Or specializing in non-marketable domestic skills. And finally, 4 more divorces, simply because the institutional exit barriers have been so drastically lowered.
And what about ex post? After the marriage?
You predict a clear increase in breaches by spouses behaving opportunistically, leveraging the legal loopholes when their participation constraint is violated. The resulting elite version of marriage cannot, by design, support the substantial, long-term, specialized investments required for a resilient traditional family structure.
This brings us squarely to the acute problem of post-contractual opportunism in the economically volatile landscape of 2026. This isn't just about emotional drift. It's about one party rationally leveraging the contract's flaws to their advantage during a systemic crisis.
Exactly. The critical factor is that the legal structure, particularly regarding asset division, alimony, and child support, disproportionately assigns downside risk to the asset accumulator, who is often the male provider. So for the rational individual who is focused on building financial security, the very trait the K strategy mate desires, the marriage contract transforms from an asset into a massive liability.
How is it framed as a liability?
For the high net worth or high earning individual, the marriage is viewed as a long-term, non-recourse loan locked into a depreciating asset class. It's a liquidity trap.
A liquidity trap.
The potential losses, the transfer of accumulated assets being anchored to long-term liabilities, they bear no rational relationship to the dwindling reciprocal benefits of the illusory contract. We analyzed the story of Julian, a highly successful software architect who was the definition of the stable, desirable mate. When his wife sought divorce amidst global economic chaos, the legal process began what he described as a slow-motion heist.
A slow motion.
His years of extreme dedication to asset accumulation and professional competence were treated as a public utility for his wife's transition into single life.
That phrase, public utility, encapsulates the structural problem. It suggests that the provider's assets are no longer private wealth subject to mutual risk, but rather an outsourced, state-sanctioned social safety net for the other party, who can choose to exit at minimal personal cost.
Precisely. The state-sanctioned contract effectively subsidizes the exiting spouse's transition while legally anchoring the provider to all the downside risk. This is the definition of the liquidity trap. Massive capital is tied up in a structure that yields negative returns upon dissolution, and the investor, the provider, cannot extract or protect their capital.
So we have a fundamental conflict. The woman is seeking absolute stability and a hedge against existential risk during the vetting process. But the contract she offers in return is asymmetrical and highly volatile for the asset holder. It seems entirely rational for the asset holder to be suspicious and to subject the potential partner to the kind of intense, almost clinical vetting you described in the cafe anecdote.
The synthesis is critical here. The pronounced demand for stability during vetting often masks an attempt to outsource existential risk. When we perform an incentive compatibility analysis, examining how incentives align with the proposed contract structure, we see the systemic pressure at work.
And what does that analysis show?
Legal structures that penalize commitment, or conversely, that effectively subsidize single-parent exits, incentivize women toward a hybrid strategy.
Tell us more about this hybrid strategy. That sounds incredibly cynical. Surely, the data you're drawing from recognizes that marriage is also about love and shared life goals, not just cold, rational economic calculations. How does the source reconcile this rational analysis with real human emotion?
That's a fair point. The sources acknowledge the existence of emotional bonds, of course, but they apply a strict economic lens to the institutional structure. They argue that incentives shape long-term behavior, even if the initial motivation is love.
Oh.
And this hybrid strategy emerges because the downside protection is institutionalized. The strategy involves two parts: short-term genetic harvesting, ensuring high-quality genetic input, and partnering with a desirable, resource-rich male, coupled with the availability of systemic provisioning via the legal structure.
I see.
If external conditions quickly improve, mate screening mechanisms can revert to a more traditional, loving partnership, perhaps operating under a free rider model of household labor. But if conditions worsen, the downside risk has been strategically transferred to the provider and the state. The legal framework turns the stable provider into an institutionalized volatility sponge,
Making him the ultimate target for outsourcing existential risk. That puts the return to safety in a very cold, rational light. It's not just about finding a good man. It's about engaging in a transaction that minimizes personal liability while maximizing existential security. And this high-stakes environment must necessitate incredibly intense vetting, the cold-blooded board meeting we heard at the cafe, because the investment is irreversible and the downside is absolute.
Absolutely. And this leads us logically to Section 3, where we examine how these power dynamics play out inside the relationship, even when commitment exists. We're discussing the subtle, persistent power shifts captured by models of limited commitment.
This section introduces economic modeling that tested how couples manage internal financial shocks and commitment within the household, specifically relying on 3 commitment modes: full commitment, no commitment, and limited commitment.
That's right. These models attempt to map the complex reality of resource sharing in real-world households. Full commitment assumes spouses agree to future allocations regardless of what happens, a purely cooperative ideal where risk is completely shared.
The ideal, yeah.
No commitment assumes spouses renegotiate every single day, with power instantly shifting based on current market conditions and the data. The empirical data gathered from real families consistently rejected both of these simplistic extremes. The evidence overwhelmingly supports the existence of limited commitment.
Okay, so let's dive deep into limited commitment. If it's not full, and it's not full bri, what does that look like day to day, and how does it manage risk?
Under limited commitment, couples do share risk fully and adhere to the initial agreed-upon allocation of resources, so the stability holds. But only up until the point where one spouse's marital participation constraint is violated.
And that constraint is?
It's essentially the boundary where one spouse realizes they could achieve a better outcome either financially or personally by exiting the marriage. That violation triggers a renegotiation of the relationship dynamics.
And what happens then?
Once renegotiated, the Pareto weight, which represents the spouse's bargaining power within the marriage, persists until the next constraint is violated.
Let's clarify Pareto weight for the listener. That's high-level economic jargon.
Of course. The Pareto weight comes from game theory and welfare economics. In this context, you can think of it simply as bargaining power or leverage.
So if my Pareto weight is higher, I have more say.
Exactly. If your Pareto weight is 0.7 and your partner's is 0.3, you have a much stronger voice in household decisions regarding resource allocation, consumption, and crucially, labor supply.
And this isn't static. It changes.
Right. The research found that this Pareto weight responds to economic shocks, but in a persistent way. A favorable wage shock, an unexpected positive increase in one spouse's earning capacity, persistently improves the bargaining power of the spouse receiving that shock.
And what's the immediate observable behavior that confirms this shift in power? How does increased bargaining power manifest in practical household terms?
The core finding is twofold, and it's perfectly rational and symmetrical. When a spouse gains bargaining power due to favorable shocks, a couple things happen.
What's the first?
One, they reduce their own labor supply. They now have increased leverage and can afford to demand more leisure time or reduce the hours they dedicate to work, either in the market or at home. They use their newfound power to buy themselves freedom.
And the second?
They increase their partner's labor supply. Their increased power shifts the burden of providing resources or contributing household labor onto the partner.
So if I get a big bonus, I might decide to work less and suggest my partner needs to pick up more of the slack at home.
That's a perfect example. It's a very direct and rational translation of economic empowerment into domestic leverage. You maximize your own utility and minimize your workload, passing that work to the partner whose outside option has relatively decreased.
And you said this is persistent.
Exactly. And this is where limited commitment distinguishes itself dramatically from the simpler no-commitment model. The study found that this relationship holds true not just for current shocks, but also for historical shocks from multiple previous periods.
Wait, you mean if I had a big wage jump 3 years ago, that specific event still influences who gets to decide who handles the early morning school run today? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but in the complex, emotional, and committed landscape of marriage, they are not bygones. The memory of past economic contribution, the fact that one partner previously demonstrated high earning capacity, lingers and contributes to the existing Pareto weight.
So past success becomes a form of stored leverage.
It does. If you had a financial success 3 years ago, that event created a foundation of leverage that persists, potentially allowing you to negotiate less labor input today. The power dynamic isn't reset daily. It accumulates over time. This persistence of shocks is the strongest evidence confirming the limited commitment model.
This research highlights that the initial conditions matter profoundly. What other initial conditions, established at the time of marriage, were found to influence this persistent bargaining power?
One fascinating finding was that initial distribution factors, such as being the younger spouse, entered the model significantly, leading to a persistently higher Pareto weight for that individual.
Why does being the younger spouse carry more bargaining power?
It's an issue of relative outside options. At the point of marriage, the younger spouse statistically has a wider, more active mating market available to them. Their outside option value, what they could achieve if the marriage dissolved, is arguably higher.
Or at least perceived to be higher.
Perceived to be higher, exactly. And this superior relative exit position gives them a slightly stronger negotiating position, the Pareto weight, which influences the power dynamic from day one.
This detailed look at commitment dynamics powerfully reinforces the survivalist pivot we introduced. If stability is sought, but the marital contract itself is an illusory risk transfer vehicle, and the internal commitment is fragile, then the initial vetting for a rock-solid, high-capacity provider becomes intensely critical. The downside risk of choosing poorly is not temporary, it is profound and persistent.
Which brings us directly to Section 4. Resource acquisition ability. If stability, persistence, and reduced risk are the goals, what objective, measurable traits signal the competence needed to withstand these shocks in the mating market?
Our sources ground this discussion in massive empirical data drawn from 1.8 million online daters across 24 nations. They focus specifically on the universally valued trait they call resource acquisition ability.
And this ability is defined rigorously as a composite measure of an individual's level of education and income.
So, proxies for competence.
Objective, quantifiable proxies for competence, drive, and the capacity to generate the stability necessary for K-strategy survivalism. And using this large cross-cultural data set, the research confirmed that, without exception, in every single nation sampled, a person's resource acquisition ability was positively associated with the amount of attention they received.
That global consistency from Sweden to China is the starting point. But what were the key persistent differences observed between the sexes in how this affinity affected desirability?
While competence boosted desirability for everyone, the payoff was dramatically asymmetrical. The key finding is this. Resource acquisition ability improved the attention received by men almost 2.5 times that of women.
2.5 times.
So a bump in income or education yielded a far greater return on investment for a man's dating prospects than it did for a woman's. This magnitude gap held universally.
So men see an enormous return on investment in their professional and financial competence, confirming that K-strategy focused on the provider. What about overall interest levels? Was there still an underlying difference in the baseline attention received?
Yes, profoundly so. Overall, the data confirmed that women generally received significantly more attention or indicators of interest than men. The figures were staggering. Women receive between 540% and 780% more IOI than men across most countries.
Wow.
Even in the United States, where the gap narrowed slightly in certain cohorts, the baseline difference in attention was heavily skewed towards women.
So women still have vastly more attention, but men who increase their competence see a dramatic increase in the quality and volume of the attention they receive. Nearly 2.5 times the proportional benefit. This sets up the great debate. Is this a cultural phenomenon reflecting societal norms or an evolved biological preference?
The cross-cultural consistency is the strongest argument for the evolutionary perspective, specifically parental investment theory. The researchers argue that if this were purely a sociological construct, the preference ought to vanish or even reverse in countries with high gender equality or high wealth.
And it didn't.
It did neither.
Explain the foundational logic of parental investment theory here so the listener understands the biological asymmetry that drives this preference.
Parental investment theory posits that the sex that invests more heavily in offspring, typically the female, due to minimum obligatory investments like gestation and lactation, will be the more selective in mate choice. This difference in investment costs creates different selection pressures. While both sexes benefit from resource abundance, women benefit more profoundly because their high biological investment costs require maximal risk reduction.
So ancestrally, this meant ensuring reliable food provision.
Yes, when gathering abilities were impaired by pregnancy or child-rearing. Today, it translates directly into financial stability and reduced childhood mortality risk. The fact that this sex difference, the increased valuing of male resources, remains robust even in modern online dating contexts, supports the theory that these are evolved mate selection tendencies.
The theory suggests the female selective pressure for male resources is a deep mechanism to protect her profound, non-recoverable biological investment. Did the study find that any country-level factors managed to moderate this effect, even slightly?
Yes, moderation occurred, but it was marginal. They examined several key macro-level demographic indicators.
Oh, really?
First, GNI, or gross national income. In richer countries, the effect of resource acquisition ability was marginally reduced.
Makes sense. Less existential stress.
Exactly. Second, OSR, or operational sex ratio. In countries with more women of reproductive age than men, the effect was also slightly reduced, likely because men have a demographic advantage and more options.
And the third?
This one was surprising. GDI, the Gender Development Index. In countries with greater measured gender equality, the effect of resource acquisition ability was slightly enlarged.
So as women gain more economic power, they become even more selective for men with resources.
That's what the data suggests. It seems that increased female economic empowerment doesn't eliminate the preference for resources in men. It might just raise the bar for entry.
That is a provocative finding.
But the overall takeaway remains. Competence and resource acquisition ability are globally, persistently, and disproportionately valued in men. The systemic pressures we've discussed make this economic competence the central criterion for passing that meticulous vetting process.
These forces, the biological pivot, the contractual asymmetry of marriage, and the global demand for male resources, naturally compel a strategic response from the individuals who are bearing the greatest contractual risk.
Which brings us to Section 5. The strategic decision to opt out. We are examining the rise of monk mode as a rational response to the systemic pressure.
Introduce monk mode for us. It sounds like an extreme isolationist practice, but the sources frame it as a strategic, temporary maneuver.
That's right. Monk mode is defined as the practice of temporarily cutting out all major distractions, social media, news, dating apps, unnecessary socializing, to achieve specific, high-value goals much faster. It functions as a self-imposed self-development cocoon, isolating oneself to emerge fundamentally transformed in competence and character.
How does this strategy function as a rational response to the systemic risks we've discussed?
For the high-value man-like, the software architect we'll call Leo in the source monk mode, becomes a sophisticated risk hedging mechanism. Leo realized that the current environment expected him to provide extraordinary stability and high economic value, but offered an illusory contract in return.
The liquidity trap.
The liquidity trap. Furthermore, his psychological sovereignty was being eroded by constant digital demands and relational tests inherent in modern dating. So the strategic goal for Leo shifted entirely. He stopped trying to negotiate the fragile provider contract, which came with guaranteed downside risks, and redirected all his energy toward establishing immutable personal sovereignty.
That's the key pivot. moving from negotiating an external contract with poor terms to fortifying one's internal capacity. They are trading the hope of a stable partnership for the certainty of self-mastery.
This is the anti-fragility investment. If the external world is fundamentally volatile economically, politically, socially, then the most rational response is to build a system that specifically gains from disorder.
Anti-fragility.
In this context, it means investing emotional and financial capital inward, funding a lifelong project of enhancing one's own competence tier, thus making oneself more resilient to external shocks. The high-value man realizes that his resource acquisition ability is his most valuable asset, and he is prioritizing its continuous enhancement, knowing the market for competence is globally persistent, while the market for commitment is locally toxic.
That's a powerful economic argument for self-isolation. If the relational market is broken and highly taxing, withdrawing energy from it and pouring it into the one thing the market truly values, competence, is the clearest arbitrage opportunity available.
It is the optimal arbitrage against systemic mating inflation, but it requires deliberate practice. Monk mode isn't just killing time or passively avoiding people.
How is it implemented?
It requires choosing a specific, measurable goal, a project, a certification, an income level, and a defined period of intensity. Distractions like social media and casual dating are framed not as petty vices, but as addictions that drain the crucial energy required for peak performance.
And what are the results of this intense, focused redirection of energy?
The results reported are often startlingly efficient. By focusing 8 or 9 out of 10 daily energy points on the single most important goal, milestones that would normally take a year of distracted effort can often be achieved in 2 to 3 months.
That's incredible.
The source material details clear benefits: increased contentment, better sleep, greater independence from external validation, and crucially, a measurable increase in resource acquisition ability.
The intensity levels vary too. It's not necessarily a lifelong vow.
Exactly. The sources detail variations for sustainability. There's the monk of the hour, which aligns with deep work principles, intense focus blocks daily. There's the intermittent monk, which involves intense sprints lasting from a week up to 6 months. And finally, the seasonal monk, choosing less socially active times like winter to focus intensely on internal development.
So it's adaptable.
The key is choosing a level of intensity that maximizes focus without triggering burnout.
This individual rational response connects to the broader cultural trend of voluntary celibacy, which the sources suggest is less about traditional religious dogma and more about personal necessity in a volatile landscape.
The data supports this. A significant minority of Gen Z adults are engaging in this practice, with 15% of men and 18% of women considering themselves voluntarily celibate. And crucially, the single most common reason reported for taking a break from sex and dating was explicitly to focus on oneself for a while.
It's a pause to recover, a necessary self-care measure, or perhaps a tactical withdrawal before re-entering a market that they find challenging, emotionally exhausting, or, as the data suggests, financially liquidating.
They are viewing it as temporarily opting out for self-care and self-empowerment. When the relational environment is described as potentially resulting in disappointment, emotional exhaustion, or the kind of financial liquidation we saw in Julian's story, withdrawal becomes the ultimate rational, high ROI decision. Monk mode is the structural solution to the liquidity trap.
We've truly come full circle. We started with the intense vetting for a human insurance policy in the cafe, and now we understand the powerful interlocking forces driving it. A primal biological response to chaos, legal structures that institutionalize risk asymmetry, persistent power dynamics within commitment, and the global, enduring value of competence.
That is the complete synthesis. The return to safety in mating is driven by a powerful confluence of 3 systemic forces. First, evolutionary pressure. High geopolitical and economic uncertainty favoring the K-strategy mate, the one who offers rock-solid stability.
The one who provides that domestic entropy reduction.
Exactly. Second, contractual erosion. Modern marriage laws creating profound contractual asymmetry and institutionalized volatility for asset accumulators, effectively transforming commitment into a high-risk liquidity trap. And third, rational response. Strategic non-participation, or monk mode, which is the clearest arbitrage opportunity against mating inflation, prioritizing personal anti-fragility and the fortification of one's own resource acquisition ability.
The system's logic compels individuals to protect their operational sovereignty first. We have established that nature is amoral. It rewards only functional adaptation. In this volatile landscape, the key to survival is understanding the vulnerabilities in the system, the illusory contracts, the persistent bargaining dynamics, the shifting biological imperatives, and fortifying oneself through relentless self-mastery. The game has changed, and survival, and ultimately selection, is found in enhancing and protecting that sovereign competence.